Welcome everybody to Truly Heal. And today, as promised, we have Benedict with us who will answer questions that you send to us. And they are in regards to diet and in regards to supplementation, nutrition. Some are related to treatments, and we've posted them right behind us so that you can always follow through what we're trying to explain. So Benedict, the very first question, which is probably the biggest of all, which is the best diet and why?
It's a complicated question. Yeah. It's huge. Well, first of all, there is no best diet.
Yeah.
It's much too complex. Our body is too complex. The conditions that we suffer from are too complex. Everyone is an individual, and therefore we each have different nutrient requirements. We each have different abilities to break down food and absorb those nutrients, and therefore there is no diet that suits everybody the same.
Yeah.
There are some general rules that we can apply to everybody, but in the grand scheme of things, there is no diet as such that works for everybody.
That fits for everybody.
That fits for everybody.
Which is one size fits all, has never worked.
No, and especially the word diet in itself is something that's generally quite radical and is only for a short period of time and doesn't actually last.
Yeah.
Whereas what we want to do is make lifestyle changes, and those are generally slightly less extreme, but therefore are things that are sustainable, and that's what's going to end up with a better health outcome in the end.
Yeah.
So
what are those basics? What are the foundations that everybody needs to look out for?
So look, we need to eat a real diet. So that means real food, no processed, no refined carbohydrates, no packaging, flavoring, additives, preservatives. Quite basic, but it still takes a change in lifestyle and your diet to achieve that, because there is a lot of additives in our food, and it's really hard to actually source everything without some sort of preserving.
I realize every single cancer patient we talk to goes like, oh my God, I didn't know that all of these things and all of these numbers and what they mean. It's a learning curve.
It's a learning curve, yeah. And it's something that doesn't happen overnight. And it's something that being given a diet is great, but in the end, it's self-education. In the end, the patient needs to become self-aware and actually have the motivation to learn themselves what sources of food there are available that don't have preservatives in them, don't have flavorings in them. What is an acceptable level of carbohydrates to have? And that's the next one. So I think that especially for cancer patients or chronic disease patients, a lower carbohydrate diet is definitely of benefit to them.
Yeah.
The less we can reduce insulin spikes, the less we have a growth factor for cancer.
Which is one of those factors that a lot of people ignore. Insulin promotes cancer growth.
Yeah.
So every time you have a spike after a meal, it promotes more cancer growth.
Yeah, so the more we can avoid that, the better it is. And that's the same with sugar. So I say roughly about 150 grams of carbohydrates per day. And by carbohydrates, I don't just mean sugar that's added to food. I mean the actual carbohydrates that are in foods, all foods. So vegetables contain carbohydrates, grains contain carbohydrates, even proteins and meats contain some carbohydrates. So we need to actually count those carbohydrates, come up with a rough diet plan that covers
There's a lot of apps that do that now, because it's actually quite challenging if you do 3 carrots and 2 broccoli and whatever you eat.
So the other thing is just hop online. Online, you can type in how much carbohydrates is there in 500 grams carrots, and it'll spit it out for you straight away. There's a couple of, like the USDA database is really good. Otherwise, self.food is really good, and they're great sources to actually get all that information as well.
Okay. So carbohydrate counting.
So carbohydrate counting, yeah. So look at something that you do at the start a little bit, just to get an understanding of what 150 grams of carbohydrates looks like. And then later on, it becomes intuitive and you don't actually need to monitor it that closely.
Yeah.
So that's one of them. The other one that I do, especially for anyone that has a chronic disease, is gluten. And that's something that I say is best avoided, just because gluten is inflammatory. It causes the release of zonulin, which stimulates leaky gut, which is the opening of those tight junctions in the small intestine. And then all those proteins that haven't been digested properly go through the bloodstream and cause inflammation in the liver. And the liver is by far one of the most important organs in our body. It rules so much of us.
I'm a bit more radical. I always say go off grain, because most people, as soon as they go gluten-free, they buy all those gluten-free processed meals and products, which is even worse.
Yeah.
So,
and that's where we go back to that there is no diet that fits everybody. So to say that for everybody would be too radical. because there's so many B vitamins, there is so many fibers, so many positive things in those non-glutinous grains like buckwheat and quinoa and amaranth.
Buckwheat is a seed.
Yeah.
Good.
But yeah,
Because I know that's one of the things I still eat.
yeah. But to say that it's not good for everybody, or rice, for instance,
Yeah.
is not good for is diminishing of what we can eat too much. So
Absolutely.
that's where the individual comes into it.
Yeah.
And for some people, we do need to go off all grains, and some people, that's because they can't absorb the phytates, and those phytates, which are anti-nutritional, so they actually bond to minerals and to vitamins, and they stop our body from absorbing them. And it's quite harsh on the gut lining. So some people can't handle those phytates.
Yeah.
Whereas other people, they have the enzymes to break those down and don't have any issues with them. Another case would be, so for instance, I say low carbohydrates. So often people put higher amounts of fat into to replace that, or protein. And for someone, so protein, for instance, if you have a kidney issue, you can't have high levels of protein. It will damage your kidneys even further. That's when we then need to modify possibly the amount of carbohydrates they eat, or replace more fat to balance that out. Someone without a gallbladder would never work with a high-fat diet.
Yeah.
Because,
I remember Dr. Schallenberger was explaining everybody should go onto a high, except those and those and those and those and those people, and all of a sudden it became clear it's still not.
And that's it. And that's why all of a sudden, when you try and put people in boxes,
Yeah.
it becomes too complicated.
Yeah.
Because you can have kidney issues, and you can have a gallbladder removed, and you can have insulin resistance, so you're not breaking down carbohydrates properly. So all of a sudden, your diet looks very, very different to what someone else's would look like.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a very loaded question.
So how do people find out? How do they find out what is best for them?
So questions. So you need to start looking at yourself very in depth. It is best to get help from a qualified practitioner, somebody who knows and understands the biology of the body very well. And then they can find out, first of all, deficiencies, what deficiencies you have in a diet that supports that and replaces those deficiencies.
Yeah, we have that as a question.
Yeah, but then also your ability to break down food. So
Okay.
some people aren't able to break down certain foods, or they need them cooked, or they need them raw, or they need them in a different form. And that's where it comes in, the individualistic side comes in. And without basically questions and in-depth investigation into your body and your body type, you're never going to find the perfect diet for you.
I have to very honestly say, this is a subject that is always very emotionally laden. A lot of people have their beliefs, and my diet is the best, and it might work for them. But if you then look at the general populace, many of them try it out. Like I tried raw food in many different forms, and I really suffered. I blown up, my body can't handle it. So I think that's what you mean. You really need to look at each individual, the symptoms and reactions. So do you try out different diets? Do you try out different things if people are unconscious? Like I never knew what my good diet or bad diet was, what resonated, or what made me blow it up, or what caused indigestion, what caused inflammation. So it's a trial and error until you get there.
To a certain extent.
Yeah.
But also a lot of that can be found out through looking at what's going on in your body, what allergies or intolerances you have, like if you don't have a gallbladder, or you're like a blood test to analyze your kidneys function, your iron status. A lot of those things aren't guesswork.
Yeah.
Eventually, there is always a certain level of trial and error when it comes to diet,
Yeah.
but I'd say that's only about 10% of diet. The rest,
So for professional, 10%. For that,
well, yeah, you
it's
can
a
keep
lot
trying.
of trial and error.
Yeah, but realistically, we should be able to find a diet that fits to you.
Yeah.
And then there's that 10% trial and error, finding certain foods, whether they agree with you or don't agree with you.
Okay. So you don't agree with any fanatic viewpoint that that's a perfect diet for everyone?
Because that doesn't work.